Today's passage is John chapter 5 verses 1 to 15. Sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish festivals. Now there is in Jerusalem near the sheep gate a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Here a great number of disabled people used to lie: the blind, the lame, the paralysed. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me." Then Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat and walk." At once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and walked. The day on which this took place was a Sabbath, and so the Jewish leaders said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath, the law forbids you to carry your mat." But he replied, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Pick up your mat and walk.'" So they asked him, "Who is this fellow who told you to pick it up and walk?" The man who was healed had no idea who it was, for Jesus had slipped away into the crowd that was there. Later, Jesus found him at the temple and said to him, "See, you are well again. Stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you." The man went away and told the Jewish leaders that it was Jesus who had made him well. Now, before we really get into the text today, I want to touch on this first. In this part of a larger passage, we aren't really getting to the point yet. The man that we meet, he's not the point. The healing that we see happen, that's not the point. That this is done on the Sabbath, kind of getting towards the point, but not quite there. John uses this larger narrative, this whole chapter, to tell us something about Jesus' identity. Not the Son of Mary, the Jesus of Galilee, but his unique relationship to God the Father and what that says about Jesus himself. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. The writer of this book uses the events that happened to build towards the point. So in what we're covering today, we're going to follow along to ensure we don't end up in the wrong place. Now, it would be easy to take Jesus' opening question to the man, "Do you want to be healed?" and build a challenging sermon from that. But the problem with that is that it would take the message in a direction that neither John nor Jesus themselves seem to. That's not the point they're getting at. This seems to be another of Jesus' remarks or questions that draws something out of the person he's talking to. Something that allows Jesus to get beyond merely the surface level. We see it with Nicodemus. Nicodemus approached Jesus as a teacher from God, someone that perhaps Nicodemus could learn from and discuss things with. But Nicodemus' real issue, for all of his own national status as a teacher of God's law, he didn't understand God's plan. He didn't understand the position that he himself was in, separate from God, condemned until he trusted Jesus and not his own goodness and heritage. Nicodemus' foundation was faulty. The woman at the well that we saw in the last chapter, she was a social outcast because of her lifestyle. But ultimately she didn't understand how to truly approach the God that she'd been confused about, the God her culture made attempts to approach in ignorance and in opposition to what God had said. Her foundation was faulty. And we have this man who Jesus asks what could be seen as a stupid question. Do you want to be healed? What the question reveals, though, is the superstition that has bound this man, Superstition not based on anything that God has said, but on ideas that his community have arrived at, traditions and beliefs of men. His foundations are faulty. And Jesus' question is exactly what draws that out of the man. Why was it only the first person that would benefit from these waters? There's no good reason given. But nonetheless, his superstition was that this is the case. And what that meant is that he gave up whenever somebody beat him to the water. In all likelihood, the way he frames his answer shows us something of the bitterness that had grown in him over time. But Jesus cuts through all this and commands him to get up and walk. There's no theatrics, there's no angels, there's no glorious shining light from heaven. Just a restoration of his body to the way that it should be. As I said, this happening on the Sabbath begins to touch on the real point of the whole passage. Jesus' identity and his right to act in the way that he does. The Jewish leaders in their wisdom had sought to make the law of God better, clearer, more easy to access, if you like, by making it more specific about things like what exactly constituted working on the Sabbath, and therefore actually missing the point of the Sabbath. What distance to walk in one stretch without rest? How many sticks of what size could be carried? There are apparently 39 different classes of work that some had broken this law down into. And it wasn't accidental or incidental that Jesus told the man to pick up his mat, thus making him break the laws of the Jewish leaders. Not the Sabbath law, not the law of God, but the law of men. Their ideas about what was right. Jesus made the man do what the Jewish leaders saw as unnecessary work on the Sabbath, picking up an empty bed. Ironically enough, if there was a sick person still in the bed or on the mat, it might have been allowable to move it on the Sabbath according to their own rules. Here's part of what the text is teaching us on the journey to making its main point. Jesus isn't undermining their additions to the law for petty reasons. He's not playing games or being provocative for fun. These leaders were only interested in this man once he broke their laws. They had no interest in his suffering or teaching him the truth as far as they knew about God. They didn't even care that he'd experienced a miracle, just that he'd gone against their authority. Jesus did what he did to reveal the truth about himself. That's the larger narrative. But in doing so, he revealed something about both the man who was healed and the Jewish leaders. How superstitions and the ideas of men can bind us, trapping us in actions and inactions that do not help us. And how for the religiously minded we can fall into the trap of only caring about what people do when they do what we think is wrong. What the Jewish leaders had done over the years and what others have done in the centuries since, up to and including our own time, this isn't something that's finished, something that's ended, is to create burdens that do nothing to actually lead people to God. And in fact, the things they create, the things they put into place, typically do the opposite. Distortions are created of who God is and what he wants, based not on what he's said, but on the ideas and additions of others. We see some of this in the letter to the Galatians, for example. Now, this typically takes one of two forms. The first is adding extra rules, rituals and requirements that are impossible to follow consistently. They create a treadmill of working to earn God's favour that a person can never fulfill. And thus a person is left as distant from peace with God as they ever were, but with the added bonus of extra guilt, a sense of failure and church burnout. The other side fails to grasp the changed life that God does call us to. They create a system of following God that essentially allows us to make our own decisions about what is moral, holy and right. And hey presto, everyone has peace with God because they've created a God who thinks like they do and unquestioningly accepts all that they do. This is the distorted Christianity that quotes to the point of dark comedy Matthew chapter 7 and verse 1, "Do not judge," without real thought about what Jesus was actually prohibiting with those words, and without recognizing that the New Testament as a whole, and Jesus' words in particular, require us to judge, but to judge rightly, as Jesus says in John chapter 7, and particularly to judge those who claim to know God and to walk with him, particularly if they also claim to speak in his name. As I said last time, John has already made it clear in chapter 3 that everyone stands condemned. We're already separated from God by both our nature and by our actions, putting our own desires ahead of God, sinning by falling short of what he has the authority to call us to do. Now, Jesus kept the law, fulfilling every requirement of God, and in doing so allows those who trust him to count as having done so too. His righteousness becomes our righteousness, and not through our hard work and law keeping, but through that trust, that faith. It is confidence in Jesus, our faith, that allows us to benefit from his death, the price he paid for the debt we owed. And it is that same faith, that same confidence in the reality and in the purpose of his resurrection that frees us from the power of sin and death. But we are not freed so that we can then just live for ourselves or set our own standards of what is good and right. Rather, because we've been given something we could never earn, peace with God, we are called to live consistently with this new life. As Jesus says, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments." Jesus sets the standard, outlined in the teaching throughout the Bible. And Paul says in his letter to the Ephesians, after talking about the gift of new life that God gives, based entirely on God's unearned kindness towards us, his grace. Paul says that we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. What does Jesus say to this man when he sees him later? Stop sinning or something worse may happen to you. We don't know this man's history, what exactly had happened to him in the past to put him in the position he was, but we do know this. He had been given a second chance, almost literally a new life. And Jesus confronts him with the choice, the reality of what happens next. As I said at the beginning, we'll get to the real point of the passage in the next couple of weeks. But on the way, we can see the dangers of distorting the true message of God, of keeping people away from God by failing to focus on what is true and important. These men, these leaders, invented sin and did nothing to bring people to God. Jesus confronted sin and became the only way to have true peace with God. Amen.